Hi, I'm Taya Williams. Thank you for joining me here on Taya's Sweet Aroma. Today I am going to be sharing with you the recipe for my pinto beans. I hesitated to share this recipe with you today because I have all of my kids home. They're all on remote learning right now, but on this day in particular, my oldest son happens to be in his first year of band. He plays the tuba, and so you can probably imagine what the house sounds like during his hour of band class, which happens to be now. But I have to get these beans on the stove because they take over 5 hours to cook and I need them ready for us for dinner. This week, my family is having we're in the middle of our meatless week. And so tonight I'm gonna be using these beans to make some tostadas. And you may recall in my very first video, which was my welcome video, I mentioned in there that some of my homemade dishes, they do take a bit of time to make, but you can use them in so many different ways that in the long run, you end up saving yourself some time. These beans are one of those dishes. I use these beans, I eat them whole. I mean, I use them, like tonight, I'm gonna be using them for tostadas. I make burritos with them. I make chimichangas with them. I make borracha beans. I use them in soups. I mean, I just love beans. I make up a pot of beans at least once a week for my family, and I use them off and on throughout the week, even as just a side dish. And so I really wanted to share this recipe with you. One thing I think about the most when I'm cooking my beans and that smell of beans is going throughout my house is my grandma's. It's funny because on my mom's side, my grandma always had a pot of beans going, but she would leave them whole and serve them up with cornbread. And when I would visit my nana on my dad's side, she would always have beans going and she would refry them and serve them up with tortillas. And so they've been a part of me and my growing up all my life. And I do the same thing with my kids. I'll make them up how my grandma did or how my nana did. And I mean, I just use them in so many different ways. And so anyhow, aside from that, one thing that I've also learned is that I'm gonna be making for you the vegetarian style, but you can also add in ham hock or like salt pork. But what I've learned is that you can also use just vegetable shortening, which is a trick that my Aunt Shell taught me years ago. And the vegetable shortening will still help that broth to get nice and just creamy and just sort of envelop those beans the way you would like them and just makes them delicious. And so I'm making for you the vegetarian style, but I still, don't get me wrong, I still make up a pot of beans with a ham hock in it when I want some of that pork flavor in my beans. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go over the steps, but let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing you want to do before you get started making your beans is you want to pick through them, and you want to pick through them very well. Here I have my pile of beans that I picked through. Here is my discard pile. And as you can see, what you're really searching for is rocks. I don't care how much the bags say that they picked through them, you will still occasionally find a rock. I also remove the broken ones. I also like to remove ones that just aren't so appealing, look like they have something on them. I don't know, but anyhow, that's just my personal choice. The main thing you wanna look for though is the rocks. I'm gonna go ahead and finish picking through the rest of my beans and then we'll go over the other ingredients. I have my beans all nicely picked through. As far as the other ingredients go, you're gonna need some water, which we'll get to in a second, some kosher salt. For this recipe in particular, I feel this is enough kosher salt. I do taste a little more towards the end, and you can do the same. If you feel it needs more salt, add some more at that time. I also have some vegetable shortening. Now, as far as the ham hock goes, I took this one out of the freezer to show you really quick. You want to make sure that you use a really good meaty ham hock. For this amount of beans, I usually use one about this size. I get them cut at our butcher shop. They have some of the best, so maybe check out your local butcher shop and see what they have available. But you want to make sure you use a really good ham hock if you are adding ham hock to it. We're doing vegetarian style, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the next step. What I'm doing now is I'm giving my beans a very good rinse. I do this for at least a couple minutes, and while I'm doing it, I kind of search through and just make sure I haven't skipped over anything that I don't want to have in my beans. You may also notice that I do not soak my beans. I don't like to soak them because I feel like when you pour off that soaking liquid, you actually end up pouring off some flavor. I like to have my broth as flavorful as I can, so I usually just go straight from rinsing them to boiling them. Also, another thing I forgot to mention is that if you are adding in a ham hock, even if it's frozen, you can add it in when we start adding in all the other ingredients. You don't have to let it get thawed. There's enough fat in the ham hock where and you're gonna cook it long enough that it'll have plenty of time to break down and get your broth nice and flavored. I'm gonna go ahead and keep rinsing these beans, and then we'll move on to the next step. So now I've added in my beans to my pot. What I'm doing now is I'm filling the pot up with liquid, and I'm trying to get it at least 2.5 inches above the beans. And that will give you the perfect amount of liquid for the entire cooking process, and you will not have to add more liquid to it later. So I've added in my vegetable shortening as well as my kosher salt. If you're using a ham hock, add it in now. We're gonna bring this pot up to a boil, and I'll show you the next step. The beans have now come to a rolling boil. You can see some of them have even risen to the top. I'm now gonna give this a really quick stir. I'm gonna cover it with my lid, turn the heat down. You can give these beans a stir every hour or so if you want, but for the most part, just let them be. They'll cook up nicely for you, and after 5 hours, I will show you the next step. My beans have now been cooking for 5 hours, and as you can see, the broth is nice and thickened. It's gonna thicken a little more because what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna allow the beans to cook uncovered for another 30 minutes, and I'll show you what they look like when I return. My beans have now been simmering uncovered for an extra 30 minutes. I did, however, turn my heat up just a little because the kind of stove that I'm cooking with, it wouldn't allow them, once I took the lid off, it wouldn't allow them to continue simmering, so I just put it up a notch. And that way you want to keep a little low bubble, and that's what's going to help everything to thicken up nicely. And as you can see, everything came together very well. The broth has thickened up. The beans have cooked through. I'm just serving myself up some of these beans that I've been waiting all day long to eat. Get a little more of this broth. And my house, it smells just like my grandmother's houses used to smell. And it's so funny how like certain foods can take us back to certain times in our life or just remind us of certain people. And beans are just that food that reminds me so much of my childhood. Get a bite. That broth is nice and silky. The beans have cooked through perfectly. They're not mushy, and they have a slight little bite to them. I think the broth is seasoned perfectly, but if you want to, after the first 5 hours of cooking, you can go ahead and add more salt in then. Since I do use these beans in a lot of different dishes, I don't add more seasoning at this point. I'll go ahead and store them up this way. If you wanted to do this in a crock pot, you can go ahead and cook them in the crock pot. It will just take a little longer. Aside from that, I thank you for spending time with me here today, and I hope you give this recipe a try. I mean, they go good just like this alongside a good piece of buttery cornbread or even just some crackers, which is how I ate them a lot at my grandmother's house. But I thank you for spending time with me today, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye.